A warm welcome to all attending this annual lecture organized by the Sheth Memorial Foundation. The Sheth Memorial Foundation is a registered charitable trust dedicated to promoting education, welfare, health, conservation, and publishing in maritime-related areas. Founded in 1993 in memory of the Indian shipping pioneer Sheth and led by Mrs. Asha Sheth as chairperson and Ketki Sheth as the managing trustee, the foundation has funded and supported over 80 projects. Projects range from scholarships, health initiatives, heritage research, environment conservation and protection, and disaster relief programs. Every year, the foundation organizes an annual lecture on a maritime subject by a distinguished speaker from India or abroad. This year, because of the pandemic, we have changed the format of the meeting to a virtual meeting. Regrettably, the format will not permit interaction with the speaker after the talk. The foundation is honored to have Mr. Lincoln Paine to give us a talk on the origins and effects of the maritime commerce between India and the United States from its origins through the 19th century. May I say a few words about Mr. Lincoln Paine? Mr. Lincoln Paine is a maritime historian, author, teacher, and curator whose chief aim is to engage people in the wonder of the maritime world in all its manifestations. He has published more than 100 articles and reviews for popular and academic audiences, and his books include the award-winning Down East, an illustrated history of maritime Maine, published in 2018, The Sea and Civilization, a maritime history of the world, published in 2013, and Ships of the World, an historical encyclopedia, published in 1997. He's currently working on a book titled Global America and How It Got That Way, the United States in Maritime Perspective. Mr. Paine has lectured on a wide range of maritime-oriented subjects, including literature of the sea, exploration, oceans and seas and world culture, the history of maritime law, trade, naval history, rivers, decorative arts, and museum curatorship in the United States, Europe, Asia, and Australia. He also teaches a course on the history of international law at the University of Maine School of Law and will be guest editor of a forum on the history of maritime law for World History Connected, appearing in 2022. He has visited India twice as a lecturer, once in Chennai and Mumbai as part of the International Writing Program, and again for the Times of India Lit Fest, where I met him. Mr. Paine has titled his talk, Separated at Birth, the Estranged History of Anglo-Indian Relations. Over to you, Mr. Paine.
England's efforts to colonize North America and India were born from the same impulse and at the same time. As early as the 1580s, the great apostle of English colonization, Richard Hakluyt Sr., thought of them in tandem, while the East India Company and the Virginia Company, whose employees established the first permanent English settlement in North America, were founded only 6 years apart, in 1600 and 1606, respectively. Considered in imperial perspective, then, India and the United States have been linked for more than 400 years, though for almost the first 2 centuries only indirectly. Ships of the 17th and 18th centuries could certainly sail between North America and the subcontinent, and the will was there. Direct trade between the 2 regions was prevented not by technology or indifference, but by policy. The East India Company monopoly on trade between England and later Great Britain and its colonies and anywhere east of the Cape of Good Hope remained in force until after American independence. Nonetheless, the people of British North America were familiar with a wide range of Indian exports in the 18th century, and following the American Revolution, American merchant mariners quickly established a trade with India that was transformative both economically and culturally. Years ago, an older friend of mine recounted a conversation he had with his new son-in-law, who worked at a major multinational bank. The son-in-law reported that at the recommendation of his team, the bank had just taken a big position in India. When he had finished his story, my friend John looked at him and said with some exasperation, "You can't take a position in India. It's a culture, not a corporation." John is neither an historian nor a banker, and he has never been to India, but this observation seems useful when thinking about India, especially the history before 1948. And although the cultural history of the United States has shallower roots, we should also conceptualize the US not in terms of the country we know today, but as a mutable place with distinctive characteristics at different points in time, starting well before independence in 1776 and changing at fairly regular intervals in the 245 years since then. As Swami Vivekananda advises us, the reason for every misunderstanding is that we see the people as we are, but not as they are. This is as true for history as for anything else. Put another way, to understand the entangled but estranged histories of the United States and India in the Age of Sail, we must reckon with the fact that these countries do not exist as some immutable Platonic ideal. Instead, looking into the past, we have to imagine a world in which the modern territories these now occupy were comparatively fragmented, technologically undeveloped, and remote, distant in time, in space from one another, just as they are distant in time from us. In the period covered here, sailing 12,000 miles between the east coast of North America and Bombay, Madras, or Calcutta took 6 months, if you were lucky, not 24 days. And that was the speed of all communication between them. There was no erasing distance with 12-hour flights or 12-millisecond internet speeds. There are other complications to conjuring a common history for India and the United States. One is that while the written roots of Indian culture can be traced back nearly 5,000 years, and with the passage of time, it becomes easier to see the English as just one among many alien people to descend on the subcontinent in its long history. The English only established colonies in North America 400 years ago. Unlike the people who wandered or fought their way into India, the settlers of English North America were animated by imperfectly formed ideas sprung from the minds of 17th century merchants, propagandists, and religious fugitives, all of whom were idealists in their own way. Moreover, intentionally or not, the English came as usurpers. Previously isolated from the rest of the world, as many as 90% of the native people of the Americas died from diseases introduced by European, Asian, and African newcomers, and with them died much of their cultures, traditions, and histories. A second difficulty is that while English ambition gave birth to Anglo-India and Anglo-America at the same time, these conjoined twins were forcibly separated at birth, as though by parents jealous of the potential for their children's success, a parenting style known to economists as mercantilism. America and India would remain estranged for nearly 200 years. And as so often happens in families reunited after traumatic ruptures, their subsequent relationship was fitful and often awkward. For much of the 16th century, Northern Europeans were spectators to the world-girdling Iberian voyages of exploration and conquest, and watched from the sidelines as Portuguese and Spanish diplomats carved up the trade of the Eastern and Western hemispheres between them. They lacked the money, experience, and administrative competence to challenge the Catholic monarchies of Southern Europe, who invested heavily to secure influence in the Protestant North. Though the lure of easy gain in the form of ships laden with gold, silver, and spices would have been incentive enough, religious enmity was one spur for English, Dutch, and French Protestants to prey on Spanish and Portuguese overseas holdings. At first, the English were content to attack Spanish ships and ports within and around the Caribbean. But by the 1580s, they sought to establish themselves in what is now the southeastern United States, from where they could attack Spanish treasure fleets en route to Europe. The most infamous or celebrated of the English raiders was Francis Drake, who after almost a decade of voyages around to the Caribbean, circumnavigated the globe via the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans between 1577 and 1580. 6 years later, Thomas Cavendish followed in his wake. Yet neither Drake nor Cavendish reached India in their travels. For them, the attractions of the East were the cloves, nutmeg, and mace of the Spice Islands in eastern Indonesia, which were then Portuguese possessions. It was with these in mind that in 1600, Elizabeth I chartered the East India Company, a joint stock company with a monopoly of English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, and that would come to play a pivotal role in the history of India for more than 250 years. At the same time, as the threat of war with Spain lessened, English interest in North America escalated. In 1606, Elizabeth's successor, James I, chartered two companies whose investors intended to gain footholds in an expansive region they called Virginia. 2 points are of particular note. More than 20% of the shareholders in the East India Company also invested in the Virginia companies, and these launched the English into two worlds that could hardly have been more different. Although the India of the subcontinent was imperfectly known, it had been on Europeans' radar since antiquity, and English merchants' ideas of the region's potential were based on a century of recent Portuguese experiences trading there. The Portuguese and Spanish might be formidable adversaries overseas, but they were not necessarily invincible. And however exotic it might be, Asia was a region of comprehensible systems of governance, law, and long-distance maritime trade. North America was a different proposition altogether. Apart from the Spanish fort at St. Augustine in Florida, there were no permanent establishments on the East Coast. Moreover, the English had no meaningful understanding of Native Americans' culture, and all but presumed that without a written language, they lacked coherent systems of government, law, or trade. This is clear from the English choice of name for the vast region they called Virginia, literally Virgin Territory. "But look upon Virginia," wrote the English propagandist Samuel Purchas, "view her lovely looks, survey her heavens, elements, situation, her divisions by arms and bays and rivers into so goodly and well-proportioned limbs and members, and in all these you shall see that she is worth the wooing and loves of the best husband." The best husband being, of course, England. The imposition of other names eradicated indigenous identity further still. New England, for the territory now occupied by the sixth northeasternmost of the United States, and Indies, or Indian, as a catch-all for the myriad clan and tribal groups that lived there. The latter term was not an English coinage. Christopher Columbus had called the people he encountered in the Caribbean Indios in the mistaken belief that he had reached India or was close to it. The conjunction of English ideas about the East and the West was nowhere more apparent than in the work of promoters of overseas expansion, who wrote of plural Indias, by which they meant places of fabulous fertility, variety, and wealth. One of these was to be found in no less a place than Virginia, which Thomas Abbe wrote in 1612, might be or breed us a second India. In so saying, he affirmed a notion articulated 24 years before by the apostle of English expansion, Richard Hakluyt, who asserted with reason and authority that goods English traders had previously scrabbled for in Europe, Asia, and Africa were either available or could be transplanted to Virginia. No sooner had 3 shiploads of settlers landed at the place they called Jamestown than the shortcomings of Hakluyt's reason and authority were revealed. Virginia was not a land of easy virtue, and she did not freely let the English have their way with her. Jamestown nearly failed due to the disease, dissension, starvation, and native hostility that plagued the colony in its first decade. In Asia, the East India Company's trials differed in magnitude and kind. its merchants had to decide what and where they wanted to trade and who they would fight for the privilege. Their initial focus was on the Spice Islands, where the Portuguese and Dutch preceded them. But they were not single-minded in their approach, and rather than contend with well-ensconced European rivals, they secured a firman to trade at Surat in 1613. James I subsequently appointed Thomas Roe as his ambassador to the court of Jahangir, and in 1618 he secured further privileges for the English to trade at Gujarat. Roe was very much a man of his time. He had explored the Amazon River in South America and subsequently served on the council for the Virginia Company. By mid-century, the East India Company was the dominant European entity in the Western Indian Ocean, a position strengthened by Charles II's acquisition of Bombay from Portugal as part of Catherine of Braganza's dowry when they married in 1661. 5 years later, Charles leased Bombay to the company for £10 a year. In focusing on India, the company had abandoned the spice trade and the all-consuming effort to enforce the monopoly that came with it. Instead, they traded goods between Britain and India and traded cheap, bulky goods within the framework of traditional inter-Asian trade. Among the most lucrative of these were Indian textiles, which quickly found an audience in England and elsewhere in Europe, though it was not until the second half of the century that calicos and chintz were in high demand. The lightweight cotton fabrics were also popular in Britain's American colonies and the West Indies. Not surprisingly, these became a staple of British trade with West Africa, especially after 1713, when the Treaty of Utrecht gave Britain the asiento, the Spanish crown's monopoly contract to transport enslaved Africans to its American colonies. This led to the explosive growth in the enslaved population of British North America. Purchased to produce tobacco, sugar, and rice, the colony's enslaved population rose from 29,000 in 1700 to 150,000 40 years later, and more than 3 times that by the eve of the Revolution. When the United States conducted its first census in 1790, enslaved Africans numbered more than 680,000, more than a third of the new nation's entire population. Thanks to the East India Company, Indian cotton growers and weavers were deeply, if unknowingly, implicated in the development of the American slave economy. Britain's domestic policies had much to do with this. By the late 17th century, the woolen industry felt threatened by the growing popularity of Indian cotton. In 1697, a mob of wool weavers and others attacked the East India Company offices in London to protest the company's import of calico. After several years of lobbying, in 1700, they secured passage of the Calico Act, which ensured that calico remained an important part of the company's business, even as it protected Britain's shepherds, spinners, weavers, and wool merchants from the competition. As the intent of the act was to preserve domestic jobs, the company was permitted to import finished goods for re-export to Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Although Europe was a much larger market than British North America, the colonists were integral to Parliament's mercantilist stratagems. Direct trade between India and America was not allowed, and all calico had to be imported to Britain for re-export to the colonies, where consumption was encouraged and welcome. In fact, per capita consumption of Indian goods was higher in the colonies than anywhere else. It helped that, in keeping with the rationale for the Calico Acts, a second of which was more restrictive and passed in 1721, wool production and cotton growing were discouraged, even though cotton was indigenous to southeastern America. So much for the promise of Virginia becoming a second India. From the company's perspective, the scheme worked well. Colonial merchants routinely advertised the availability of goods from India, and the East India Company accommodated consumer preferences by producing textiles with patterns and motifs that suited their tastes. One upshot of all of this was that British North America had a greater choice of fabrics than did people in Britain itself. Nonetheless, enthusiasm for Indian goods was not universal. As in the home country, there was anxiety about the corrupting influence of Eastern luxuries on both moral and economic grounds. Some wanted to ban calico to encourage colonial manufacturing, an idea that ran counter to the intent of the Calico Acts, while others decried the enormous trade deficit between the colonies and Britain, much of it due to the purchase of Indian goods. Then, too, smuggling cotton was widespread, and the government was at pains to strike a balance between encouraging cotton consumption and controlling the trade to its profit. The English were not the only Europeans trading in India at the time. The Portuguese, Dutch, Danes, and French all had a presence, and conflicts at other points of friction, whether elsewhere in Asia, in Europe, Africa, or the Americas, could embroil Europeans in India. In the 7 Years' War, from 1757 to 1763, the biggest loser was the Nawab of Bengal, a French ally whom the British defeated at the Battle of Plassey. In 1765, the East India Company secured the Diwani, the revenue administration of Bengal, thus becoming the de facto rulers of the province. The company's exploitative tax policies, combined with a drought in 1769, led to the Bengal famine and the death of between 2 and 6 million people, and perhaps as many as 10 million. Widely considered the First World War, the 7 Years' War had a North American component from which Britain won Canada from France and Florida from Spain. While the Diwani helped cover the expense of the conflict in India, no comparable mechanism existed in North America. To help defray the costs of the war there, Parliament attempted to regulate trade, increase revenues from duties, and, for the first time, to impose direct taxes on the colonists through the Stamp Act. Colonial reaction to the Stamp Act was colored by the shocking news of the man-made catastrophe unfolding in Bengal, and took the form of petitions to Parliament, editorials, violence against British officials, and a boycott of British goods. Unity of purpose ensured the Act's repeal a year later, but Parliament asserted its right to pass whatever legislation it liked, including taxes. Parliament then passed the Townshend Acts, a thinly disguised set of taxes on a variety of imports to North America, the revenues earmarked for the expanding bureaucratic apparatus needed to manage the increasingly restive colonies. It hardly seemed worth the effort. As one critic put it, America hangs like a wasting disease on the strength of Britain. And North America generated barely a quarter of the revenue that Bengal did. A new boycott ensued, and by 1769, the colonial exports were valued at 800,000 pounds more than imports, a stark reversal of the normal balance of trade. Parliament backed down again, although it did leave a 3% tax on tea. Although introduced into America in the 17th century, due to the expense of the tea itself and the associated paraphernalia, tea remained the preserve of the well-to-do until well into the 1700s, when the East India Company began marketing it heavily. This, of course, was Chinese tea. Commercial tea growing in India did not begin until the 1840s. But the East India Company monopolized tea imports to Britain just as it did cotton. Despite this dual monopoly, control of the Bengal Diwani, and other advantages, by the 1700s, the company was in dire financial straits, and the government was desperate to keep it solvent. In an effort to do so, Parliament approved the Tea Act, which for the first time gave the company the right to sell directly into the North American market, a change that threatened to undermine private traders. The Tea Act passed as the full horror of the Bengal famine was still being reported, and its opponents seized on the obvious parallels between the increasingly heavy hand with which Britain wanted to rule North America and the company's catastrophic mishandling of events in India. Jonathan Shipley, an Anglican bishop sympathetic to the colonists, reminded his readers, "We need only recollect that our countrymen in India have in the space of 5 or 6 years, in virtue of this right of taxation, destroyed, starved, and driven away more inhabitants from Bengal than are to be found at present in all our American colonies. This was no exaggeration. The total population of the 13 colonies at the time was about 2.5 million. Despite the outward difference between the colonies of British America and company rule in India, everyone knew that the East India Company served at the pleasure of the British government. Thus, the company's actions in India could be taken as a reliable gauge of what could happen in America. As the revolutionary pamphleteer Thomas Paine warned, the British had ravaged one part of the globe till it could glut them no longer. Their prodigality required new plunder, and through the East India Article T, they hoped to transfer their rapine from that quarter of the world to this. That the far-flung relations were thought of in the same context in Great Britain itself is apparent from the fact that reformers had considered transplanting to India modes of governance found in British North America, including assemblies and councils. However, nothing came of these recommendations. In the end, the most visible display of opposition to the Tea Act came in a series of so-called tea parties, in which patriots, sometimes dressed as American Indians, forced their way onto ships loaded with tea and dumped the offending cargoes overboard. The government countered with still more punitive legislation, including one act that banned the very assemblies that had been contemplated for India. As a result, in 1776, 13 British colonies, not including Canada or the Floridas, declared their independence as the United States. 5 years later, the rebel army under George Washington forced the surrender of the British under Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia, a mere 15 miles from the site of the first English settlement at Jamestown. With the conclusion of the Treaty of Paris, Britain recognized American independence in 1783. No sooner was the United States on its own in the world than its merchants began to look for new trading opportunities. The British West Indies, with which the colonies had had a symbiotic relationship for 150 years, were all but off limits. French and Dutch traders were only too happy to provide goods from Europe, including Indian goods, but it would be far cheaper for the Americans to get these themselves. The ink was hardly dry on the Treaty of Paris when Ezra Stiles, president of Yale College, wrote, "Navigation will carry the American flag around the globe itself and display the 13 stripes and new constellation at Bengal and Canton on the Indus and Ganges." 2 years later, Ambassador John Adams wrote from London, "There is no better advice to be given to the merchants of the United States than to push their commerce to the East Indies as fast and as far as it can go. Because we have no such manufacturers for them to interfere with, we may take them," that is textiles, "to a great advantage." His assessment was correct, but the facts on the ground were changing fast. Americans certainly had the advantage of not having to contend with the East India Company's monopoly. But despite this, and the fact that they had an excellent idea of what goods were on offer in Indian ports, few Americans had any firsthand experience of the trade. In some respects, their view of Asia was as vague as Europeans' ideas had been 2 centuries before. Among the most celebrated and successful families of the Federalist era, the period up to about 1801, was the Derbys of Salem, Massachusetts. On back-to-back voyages to the Indian Ocean, Elias Haskett Derby instructed his son to sail by way of the Cape of Good Hope in 1785 and Mauritius in 1786. He fully expected these were centers of trade in their own right, only to discover that they functioned as little more than rest areas for long-distance shipping. When Derby later suggested that his son go to the Coromandel coast, he confessed, "This I know little about." With persistence, he soon cracked the code, however. and the profits from his India trade made Derby the United States' first millionaire. American success in the India trade was due in large part to the fact that Britain and France were at war from 1792 to 1815, and as neutrals, Americans could theoretically sail almost anywhere with impunity. Some pro-monopoly members of the East India Company protested that their own employees were using the cover of the American flag to ship goods on their own account, and that Americans were profiting from re-exports of Indian goods from the United States to Britain and Europe. This much was true. Between 1794 and 1800, the value of American re-exports grew 7.5 times. This was possible because on the whole, the British government and the company adopted a laissez-faire attitude towards the Americans. Even Cornwallis, who had assumed the role of Governor General of the Bengal Presidency 5 years after his defeat at Yorktown, ordered that Americans be given most favored nation status. This was enshrined in the Jay Treaty of 1794, which stipulated that vessels belonging to the citizens of the United States of America shall be admitted and hospitably received in all the seaports and harbors of the British territories in the East Indies. In the Americans' favor, as they produced little that the Indian market wanted, they paid for many of their purchases with silver, which the British needed to pay for the war and to purchase tea in China. This period of rapid growth in the American-India trade came to a shuddering halt in 1807. As important as Americans were as neutral carriers, American shipping was subject to relentless attacks from both the French, who sought to disrupt Britain's trade, and the British, who had similar goals with respect to French-occupied Europe. In addition, the British routinely stopped American ships to seize ostensibly British nationals for impressment into the Royal Navy. President Thomas Jefferson favored agriculture and the cultivation of domestic manufactures over international trade. More to the point, perhaps, he had neither a fleet capable of protecting American commerce against the world's two most powerful navies, nor the wherewithal to build one. Over the objections of merchants in international trade, who viewed their losses as the cost of doing business, Jefferson imposed a sweeping embargo on all ships and vessels in the ports and places within the limits or jurisdiction of the United States bound to any foreign port or place. The effect was devastating. Imports fell by half, and the maritime industries lost some 55,000 jobs. British shippers welcomed the opportunity to regain some of the India trade, but others viewed Jefferson's action as an attempt to aid the blockade of the European continent as proclaimed by the French ruler, in the joint expectation of destroying the commercial prosperity of Great Britain and of thereby annihilating her existence as a nation. Repealed a year later, the embargo proved more damaging to the US economy than to Britain's, but such a claim testifies to the significant role Americans played in international trade. In the long term, however, the embargo accelerated systemic changes already 20 years in the making. With no foreign commerce to absorb their capital, Americans began to invest elsewhere, including textile mills. For this, of course, they needed cotton, which was now available from southern states where planters had started growing it during the Revolution. In the post-war period, cotton cultivation was spurred by the rise of Britain's textile industry, which, thanks to several key innovations, including the application of steam power, had become more efficient than Indian manufacturing. Initially, Britain's cotton came from the Ottoman Empire, the West Indies, Brazil, and a little from India. In 1785, a small shipment of American cotton was landed in Liverpool, where customs inspectors assumed it was contraband from the West Indies. This was the harbinger of an enormous shift in what historian Sven Beckert calls the global empire of cotton. 5 years later, Americans grew 1.5 million pounds of cotton. In 1800, 7 years after Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin for separating cotton fiber from its seed, production was 36.5 million pounds. In 1802, the United States accounted for 80% of Britain's imports of raw cotton. And in the year before the embargo took effect, Britain imported 44 million pounds of American cotton. Meanwhile, the first American cotton mill had begun operation in New England. The American textile industry grew rapidly, but even so, the overwhelming bulk of cotton was grown for export, more than half in 1800, 70% a decade later, and 87% at mid-century. Nonetheless, American production was enough to warrant protective tariffs on imported textiles, including those from India, which were levied in 1816. It had taken more than 2 centuries and separation of the colonies from the mother country, but at long last, Thomas Abbe's vision that North America might be or breed us a second India had come to pass, though largely at the expense of the first India. In 1805, the United States imported $170,000 worth of Indian textiles, but almost 60 times more, roughly $10 million worth, of British-made cotton textiles, including calicos and muslins. Within a few decades, American ships would actually be exporting cotton textiles to India, and in the 1850s, this accounted for almost half the country's exports to India. As bad as things were for Bengal, the greatest victims of this restructuring of the global cotton supply were the enslaved people of African descent in the United States, who grew and processed the bulk of the raw material that fed British, European, and American mills. The irony of Bengal's fate is, as we've seen, that the enslavement of their ancestors had been facilitated by the availability of Indian textiles for trade in West Africa. The meteoric rise of America's cotton industry, or the Anglo-American cotton industry, Parliament's withdrawal of the East India Company's monopoly of trade east of the Cape in 1814, the American protectionist legislation of 1816, and the United States accelerating westward expansion meant that Americans had less incentive to trade with India. Following the lead of their British counterparts, however, American evangelical missionaries began going there. Although Christianity as a universal religion is practiced, it is not necessarily a democratic one. Writing for a domestic audience, many American missionaries were scathing in their characteristics of Hindus, especially on religious, cultural, and ethnic grounds. Yet religious ideas flowed in many directions. Ancient Indian texts had begun to attract scholarly attention in Britain in the late 1700s, and knowledge of India's sacred literature began circulating in the United States by the early 1800s. Among the people most influenced by their teaching was Ralph Waldo Emerson, the leading figure of the American Transcendentalist movement, whose advocates, including Henry David Thoreau, drew heavily on Hindu texts, including the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas, and the Upanishads. Emerson himself was heavily indebted to the teachings of the Unitarian Ram Mohan Roy, a living representative of all those virtues of idealism and high-mindedness that Emerson found in India's sacred writing, and whose beliefs are also echoed in the writings of Swami Vivekananda. The rise of Transcendentalism coincided with the start of the most distinctive trade between the United States and India. Early in the 19th century, a young Boston entrepreneur named Frederick Tudor hit on the idea of carving ice out of lakes and rivers in Massachusetts and shipping it to seaports in tropical climates, including the American South, the Caribbean, and South America. He met with great success, but a quarter century later, he lost his fortune speculating in coffee. In an effort to recover, he returned to this ice trade with renewed vigor and bent on opening the Indian market. As unlikely as it seems today, despite a voyage of some 12,000 miles under sail in which ships crossed the equator twice, enough ice remained for the trade to be profitable. His first shipment, 100 tons of ice, reached Calcutta in 1833, and Bombay and Madras subsequently became regular destinations too. A decade later, while wintering on Walden Pond, for which his best-known work is named, the sight of men harvesting ice for export from the nearby port of Boston moved Thoreau to write, "Thus it appears that the sweltering inhabitants of Charleston and New Orleans, of Madras and Bombay and Calcutta drink at my well. In the morning, I bathe my intellect in the stupendous and cosmogonal philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, since whose composition years of the gods have elapsed, and in comparison with which our modern world and its literature seem puny and trivial. The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred waters of the Ganges." The waters of Walden Pond may no longer transcend space to melt into those of the Ganga, but a tangible reminder of the intellectual currents that flow through Thoreau endures. Erected in 1842, the only one of the elaborate structures for storing ice still is now the Vivekananda House in Chennai, in what we might see as a symbolic joining of the plural Indias imagined by Thomas Abbey 4 centuries ago. Thank you.